provocations, if you will. And then what we're going to do is, after the three speakers make their opening comments, we're going to have a 25-minute or so kind of unstructured conversation between our three speakers, and then there'll be time at the end for question and answer. The three speakers who I shall introduce now in the order in which they will first comment. Jeff Halper is an Israeli anthropologist. As many of you know, he serves as the director of ICAHD, or the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions in Jerusalem, and is founding member of the One Democratic State campaign. Jeff's latest book is Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, Zionism, Settler Colonialism, and the Case for One Democratic State, out in 2021 by Pluto Press. Our next speaker, Arnan Degani, is a historian of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He is currently a Lady Davis Fellow at the Avraham Harman Research Center of Contemporary Jewry at the Hebrew University, and a research fellow at Molad, the Center for the Renewal of Israeli Democracy. Dr. Degani is currently working on his first book, which details the integration of the Palestinian citizens into Israeli society in the years 1948 to 1967. And then finally, Elliot Rotzman holds a PhD in religion, ethics, and politics from Princeton University. He's completing his first book. I believe it's his first book. So he'll correct me if I'm wrong. His first book is Zipporah's Knife, A Jewish Reckoning with Race. Fascinating title, and a book that will encompass Jewish ethics, critical race theory, and anti-racist activism in the United States, Israel, Palestine, and Europe. I've told you already about the format for today, so we'll just get started. We'll turn the floor over for a few minutes to Jeff Halper first. So go right ahead, Jeff. Floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Tom. I'm just going to say a few words to just kind of frame the discussion tonight, and then I'm going to let Arnon speak first, and then Elliot, and then I'll come in at the end. I just want to say that this is going to be an interesting experiment, because it's kind of a combination of political and academic. You know, ICAHD is a very political organization, and we have a very political agenda, which has to do with, well, as you all know, decolonization and setting up one democratic state. But at the same time, on the way to that program, there's a lot of discussion that has to happen. And what we have to be sure about is that, you know, we diagnose the problem the right way. Because the better we have an understanding of what the issues are and what the structures are and what the logic is of this whole conflict, as it's called, the better we'll be able to formulate a kind of political plan that could resolve it. Because what we've been experiencing all these years is a conflict resolution approach that hasn't been appropriate to this, because in my view, at least, it's not a conflict. So that's kind of the idea. So the first part will be much more academic, which is fine, because we really have to explore a lot of these issues. And part of the idea of this webinar and of what ICAHD is doing in general is to try to amplify the voices of critical Israelis and critical Jews, like Elliot, for example, who's in the US, in terms of bringing their voices into this discussion. Those are voices that are sometimes neglected, but they're really crucial, since whether we like it or not, Zionism is a part of this whole, is part of the whole issue here that we have to deal with. So and then we'll go a little bit, and we'll try to kind of relate the ideas we've talked about in terms of Zionism, settler colonialism, nationalism, the different issues that come up with where are we going with this all? You know, how can this relate to a political program? So with that, I'll turn it over to Arnon.
If once again, everybody could please hit their mute button, that would be great. Arnon, please, the floor is yours.
I think he's muted.
I mean,
Hi. Sorry.
Okay, great. We've got you.
This thing and this still happens. So usually the crowds that I face are.
We don't hear him.
Arnan, your mic's not working there. Can you speak up?
My mic is not working. How are we doing now?
Okay, that's better.
Okay.
Okay, let's hope so I said before, 2 years into this thing and these problems have not gone away. It's very frustrating.
Arnon, it's still very faint. Maybe you just have to be closer to the microphone and stay there.
How are we doing now?
That's a little
Better?
bit.
That's better.
Yeah, stay that close.
You don't sound very.
Go right ahead.
Just a sec. I will connect via my cell phone. It always.
Oh, now it's working. Oh, you're fine.
Okay. Is it better now?
Yeah.
Okay. So usually I present my work, my ideas in front of a more centrist or even more right-leaning audience, and so usually I have to begin with some sort of defense mechanism for my work to kind of not be to help people keep an open mind at least. Can you allow me to share? Never mind. We wasted too much time. I'll just quote from the page. So let me just quote from a very well-known BDS activist verging on the anti-Semitic. Maybe you've heard of him. His name was Zev Jabotinsky. And he wrote in 1923 in what is probably revisionist Zionism's seminal text, and I think time proved that this is a Zionist text. This is a seminal Zionist text to begin with, the Iron Wall. And
Arnan, your audio is really poor. It's going very much in and out. Perhaps we should pause and recalibrate here.
Or if you stay really close to the microphone and hold it there, I know that's hard, but
I think that his cell phone is probably a better idea. Okay, you're on now with your cell.
Okay.
okay.
Are you with us, Arnan?
Yes.
Okay. If you could just speak a little bit more, a little louder, more loudly, and project as much as you can. It's kind of faded. We're getting comments saying that you're not, but try as well as you can right now, and let's see what happens. Go right ahead.
No, he's frozen.
Arnan is calling in from Jerusalem, and there may well be something. Arnan, are you there now?
Yes, I'm here. How's
Okay.
it now?
It's moderate. Try your best and see. We'll see how it goes. Maybe we'll shift over to Elliot but please go right ahead.
Just to read from Jabotinsky, the following forward. My readers have a general idea of the history of colonization in other countries. Okay. That they consider all the precedents they are opposed
Oh, it's not working.
to.
No.
Still not working. Why don't we go to Elliot and then Arnon can.
Okay.
give
Arnon,
that
if
chance
you
to
can
get-
hear, if you can hear me, Arnon, maybe we'll let you try to dial in again or call in again, and we'll move to if Elliot, if you're okay, because the audio quality is really poor. Can we circle back to you, Arnon, and maybe after
Oh, it's just
we'll go to Elliot Rotzman now.
I'm trying to. I don't know what else I can do. I change room.
Okay. Why don't we let's go to Elliot, and then we'll go to Jeff, and then we'll come back to you, Arnon. And perhaps something will have worked itself out. I'm sorry on this end, but the quality is just not consistently the audibility of it is not satisfactory. So we'll come back to you. We'll try again. But Elliot Rotzman, if you're there, if you might like to jump in for your opening comments. Are you with us, Elliot?
I am. Can you all hear me?
Yes, that's very good, actually.
Okay. So let me just say as a matter of warm up, Arnon's writing and thinking about settler colonialism is really interesting, especially his ideas about the solution to this. So hopefully when Arnon joins us once this technical snafu gets worked out, I want you to be very excited. In any case, I will put in the chat in a few minutes some of the links to Arnon's writings from Haaretz in case the technical snafus don't work out. Let me just say that I believe we're all on basically the same page. I come from this perspective as having worked with Jeff in the early years of the Committee Against House Demolitions, working with the left in Israel and Palestine, as well as working with J Street for many years here in the United States for a just two-state solution and breaking the hegemony of AIPAC in the US. And so in my role, I've worked with a lot of Jewish communities, a lot of Jewish people, people who identify with Israel on some level. They might call themselves a Zionist. Most of them probably do not, but their level of engagement with the state of Israel, rooting for the state of Israel in some vague way, would tag them as quote unquote Zionists to especially Palestinian advocates. And thus the issue of how we speak of Zionism is a very important element in our strategy for peace and justice for Palestinians. That is how American Jews understand the history of Israel, the Palestinian-Israeli situation is crucial for getting some leverage in actually moving the needle on American policy and American Jewish attitudes towards the state of Israel. This is a debate Jeff Halper and I have been having for years and years about what the proper role is. And while I do think Jeff is an amazing resource, especially a convincing, compelling figure in front of an audience, we can't scale him up to address all American Jews or people ambivalent at best concerning Israel. So when we talk about Zionism, one thing that Jeff and I disagree with, which we may come back to, is I don't see about Zionism as an ideology, as having an essence, is very useful. There are a lot of ideological projects, whether they're political or religious, that have a terrible history. In fact, most of history is terrible, but who have elements of great truth to them and better strands and traditions that we want to hold up and favor over the streams and strands that end up usually taking power. For example, the Communist Project, you've heard the old chestnut, good in theory, bad in practice. But yet there was a conservative move mid-century to say even the very ideas of communism were in their infancy or in their essence violent. I fear the same thing is happening with something called Zionism, of which there's many, many, many varieties. Some varieties, like the ones that I might subscribe to, are at great tension with the state of Israel, its policies, its racism, its colonialism, and thus it should be preserved over and against its actual existing terrible narrative of how it worked out. We might say the same thing about religious practices. Christianity is just not the Crusades and the witch trials. It's something more, an ideal. I want to say that Zionism encompasses more than the racism, colonialism, and it's more than the Nakba, more than all the discrimination against Arab citizens of Israel, and this element is very important for some, maybe many American Jews. And so we should distinguish what we're talking about when we're talking about the evil practices of the state of Israel, when we have to also see them as not particularly different from other nationalist, other colonial,
Yes.
other perhaps settler colonial practices of other state projects. By awfulizing the state of Israel, we demonize the state of Israel, and that's not good for a political strategy in curing the problems and better, just, equitable future. Now, the term colonialism, in my mind, came to attention with Robinson's book, Is Israel a Settler Colonial State?, which was originally an article in French from the 70s. And it seemed to be at the most outskirt, the left-wing outskirts of thinking about Israel that I had encountered as a student. As the years go by and Israel, or the Zionist project, was tagged in left-wing circles as colonialist here in the United States, it then invited a whole bunch of reactions from erstwhile liberal or erstwhile left-wing Jews to talk about the state of Israel as always having been a colonial project. In some ways illegitimates it. It says it's something like South Africa, apartheid South Africa, and the delusions of the Afrikaners. So I want to stress that the settler colonial frame, which Arnon has makes some really brilliant distinctions about, even further complicates and confuses well-meaning Jewish allies who are not quite sure what to make of the claim. And so maybe another disagreement with Jeff, which we can circle back to, is I think while we can narrate the history of Israel or the phenomena of Zionism as a settler colonial something, I don't think that gets us very much when we actually talk about the activism and the visioning of what it would mean for the next step. For those of you who haven't read Jeff's book, Decolonizing Israel, Liberating Palestine, I'll put the link in the chat. It's a very important, great vision, certainly pushing the envelope for Israel-identified Jews. However, I also think that when talking to, say, in my situation, synagogues, youth groups, film festivals, Jews who are thinking about Israel, but also share all of our values in that they don't like racism, they have allergic reaction to unwanted violence, who generally have a liberal view of the world in which people should have equality, there should be fairness, and other values that American Jews have. I'm not sure that the use of the term settler colonialism, which seems to have a very precise academic framing, comes in as very useful when talking about Jews. Now, I'm talking about the Jews who are sympathetic to the empirical problems of Palestinians, either subjects or citizens of the state of Israel. To diagnose Israel as a settler colonial state, I feel just makes Jews react in a way that doesn't open them up for the kind of transformational policy work and interpersonal work that needs to happen. My argument is that there are certainly the state of Israel and aspects of Zionism that are a settler or colonial. There's certainly racism. There's certainly ways we can talk about it being a settler colonial project. But I want to say it goes beyond that. There's an affective, an emotional dimension amongst American Jews talking about Israel and the plight of the Palestinians, however that's framed, that I don't think settler colonialism brings much to the table, although I'm willing to be convinced otherwise and look forward to hearing alternative perspectives. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Elliot. That was very good, very concise, and you did it all in 9 minutes. And so thank you very much for staying on time. And I think what we'll do now is turn to Jeff Helper, and then we'll circle back to Arnan and try to get him technologically available. But Jeff, if you're there and your mic is on, maybe I'll turn it over to you now for the next 8 or 10 minutes. Why don't you go ahead, Jeff?
Okay. All right. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Elliot, as well. Look, I mean, I certainly agree with Elliot that there's a lot of different opinions when you're talking about an ideology and a history of people, and you know, people are different and so on. So I'm not trying to put all Zionists in one box, but at the same time, I mean, what we can see, I mean, we have a framework of 140 years in which something has happened very systematically, very structurally, with a very clear logic, a very clear agenda and policy over the last 140 years, not over the last 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, 140 years. And that you have to give that a name because it's not going to end today. It's going to continue. And if it continues, it really defines the situation that you're trying to resolve. So that, you know, the name, you know, many people give it these days is settler colonialism. It's true. This is an analysis that's only about 20 years old or so. Although Rodman wrote his book a long time ago, but it's really come to fruition in the last 20 years or so. And it's very useful, I think, settler colonialism, not as a way of condemning people or accusing people or demonizing people, but to give a name to what's happening. And as much as different Zionists might have had different opinions and different views and more liberal or less liberal or whatever, including you know, Brit Shalom and people that were even envisioned a binational state. At the same time, we can't ignore the fact that for the last 140 years, or certainly since the beginning of Zionism in 1897, there has been a concentrated, organized, ideologically consistent campaign to take over Palestine, and the Zionists were very upfront about that, to take over Palestine, to Judaize Palestine, to transform an Arab country into a Jewish country, to transform Palestine into the land of Israel, and to displace the local population. I mean, Ben-Gurion said at one time, unless Israel, the state of Israel is 85% Jewish, it's not viable. So it's clear, in other words, it's not that I'm blaming Zionism in particular, Jews, but that there are other settler colonial movements in the world. The United States is one, certainly, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Algeria, different countries in Africa, including South Africa. There's a lot of examples of settler colonialism, and when you get into it, and that's what I try to write in my book, they're very similar. In other words, the same process that we have for Israel is not unique to Zionism. It's another settler colonial project with its own narrative and its own dynamic in a particular country and so on. But in terms of its structure and its progression and its agenda, it's very close to all other settler colonial movements. So we're not talking about something unusual or something exceptional. We're talking about a settler colonial movement that's like many others. Now, a lot of people object and say, well, but wait a minute, you can't ignore the national part. The Jews are a national group, rights of self-determination. This is a national movement back to a territory that Jews claimed, and therefore it is a conflict of two nationalisms, is right? Jewish nationalism and Palestinian, and that somehow gives legitimacy to it. in terms of nationalism, there's two problems with that. First of all, Zionism represented, at the turn of the 20th century, about 3% of the Jewish people. In other words, something like 95, 97% of the Jews did not accept the idea that Jews are a national group. I don't think Eliot accepts the idea that Jews are a national group. Now, if you ask Jews in America, what's your nationality, they'll pull out their American passport and they'll get very upset if you, like Trump once did, to talk about Israel as your country because they're Americans. So the vast, vast majority of Jews never accepted the idea of Zionism, at least as the idea, even though it's true there is an Israeli national group today. The other problem with nationalism is it wasn't nationalism like you know it in the United States or Canada or wherever the UK, in Western Europe, wherever you guys are all from. That kind of nationalism that emerged in the 19th century was what we could call a civic nationalism. In other words, it was based on the idea that there's a state, and the state, everybody belongs to the state. And the way you belong to the state is as a citizen, not as a collective. Not as the state doesn't belong to a particular ethnic group. I can tell from Tom's body language that I'm getting close to my 10 minutes.
No, you've got 3 more minutes. You're fine.
So, all right. And the difference is that the nationalism that Zionism came out of and still represents is the nationalism of Eastern Europe. That's where the Jews came from, that came here. In other words, Russia, Poland, Hungary, the parts of, and there you have a very different nationalism than you have in the United States or in Europe, Western Europe, and that is a nationalism that says a country belongs to a particular group. Hungary belongs to Hungarians. And you hear it today. You can see Orban trying, that rejects even one immigrant coming into Hungary. Russia is the same. Russia belongs to Russians. Poland belongs to Poles. And that was the kind of nationalism the Jews accepted. So in a sense, where they were coming from in terms of their nationalism fed right into settler colonialism, because they came with the claim that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people. There's only one claimant, because in this kind of an ethno-nationalist conception, you can't have two national groups that claim the same land. So from the very beginning, Zionism said there is no people, right, in Palestine. There are people in Palestine, but no other collectivity that has national rights of self-determination like we do. So that the land of Israel then was exclusively ours, and we came to take it back. And there was no recognition of the native population. I know Jabotinsky mentioned the natives. I think that was an unfortunate slip on his part, but I don't think Zionism ever, as a movement and as a structure with the logic of settler colonialism and ethno-nationalism, it was like a double whammy, never recognized the presence, the national existence of a Palestinian people until today. And so what we see today is simply the ongoing settler colonial project that is now taking the rest of Palestine. Having taken 78% in 1948, they took the rest in 1967. And the same thing is going on, the same thing, settlement, the displacement of the indigenous population, and creating a state of Israel that replaces everything Palestinian. You replace the people, you take the land, you replace the names. The rivers, the mountains, the valleys all have Hebrew names today. And that's the idea of settler colonialism. And it's not unique to Zionism. That's true of all settler colonial movements. And they all make up a narrative about why the country belongs to them. We have our Zionist narrative based on the Bible and all that stuff. Other groups have, including Americans, have their narratives. So
okay, Jeff, you've got a minute. You've got a minute.
So from my point of view, that's the problem. And the question then becomes, and this is a question we have to ask later on, if this is true, how do you get out of this? How do you resolve a settler colonial situation? Conflict, compromise, negotiations, making deals, peace processes, they can't do that. It's not a conflict resolution issue. It has to do with decolonization. So I would say that the idea of ethno-nationalism in Judaism from Eastern Europe, feeding into a settler colonial movement that still is going on to take another country, can only be resolved through decolonization. And which means, from my point of view, one democratic state. Now, if Elliot and Arnan have another analysis of what Zionism is, then maybe they'll get to another conclusion, whether it's a two-state idea or some other idea. But you've got to connect. But you have to connect the analysis of the problem. You have to connect what you're talking about with how do you end it? How do you resolve the colonial issue? So I'll leave it.
Thanks, Jeff. Arnan, I know you're itching to get back in, and I hope that technologically we've resolved your issues. Why don't you respond for 8 or 10 minutes yourself, and we'll see where it goes, and hopefully we'll be able to hear you if you speak right into the mic.
How are we doing? Can you hear me?
Not well, Arnan.
How are we doing?
That's a little better.
How are we doing now?
That's better still. Why don't you continue?
Fine. This is very awkward, but fine. Where do I start? Oh yeah, I started with Jabotinsky, same of BDS.
No.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Arnan. Arnan, please go ahead.
All my readers have a general idea of the history of colonization in other countries. I suggest that they consider all the precedents with which they are acquainted and see whether there is one solitary instance of any colonization being carried on with the consent of the native population. So, in this segment right here, Jabotinsky essentially performs a settler colonial analysis of Zionism. Jabotinsky himself. Of course, Jabotinsky was believed in the myths of Zionism. Okay, I see this isn't working, so I'm sorry. I don't know what else to do.
Arnan, why don't
I'm so last.
Please go ahead. Try to make at least one last point. Arnan, are you there?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out.
Yes, we're. Arnan, there's one comment in the chat room that might be helpful. Could you put on your closed captioning, and maybe at least we get to be able to read and try to follow along with your audio?
I will try. Where is the closed captioning? Where is it located?
I am not entirely sure. I'm looking around. It may not exist. Let's see. Well, Arnan, you seem to be coming in sort of bits and sort of moments. So what we might want to do is move to if your sound quality is really not going to get much better, maybe
Okay,
we need.
How is this? Is this better?
Just vaguely better. Go ahead, try for another minute or two, and then if not, we'll have to move to general discussion and try to sort of have you come in bits. but go ahead, Arnan. You have, fully 3 or 4 minutes. Arnan, are you there? Okay, this doesn't look like it's going. Okay, try again.
How's this? How's it going now?
Go ahead. That's better.
Is it better?
It is. Trust me.
Okay, fine. Look, 95% of the people, I'm just go straight to the point. 95% of people who talk about settler colonialism don't know what they're talking about. They haven't read the literature. They haven't read the literature closely, and they are using it in a kind of casual way, usually as a way of saying, well, Israel isn't exactly like colonialism because there's no metropole, there's no mother country, and there are settlers, and there's settlers in the West Bank, so it sounds like it fits. So we'll call it just settler colonialism. Basically, it's just slapping the word settler on the word colonialism, slapping that on Zionism, without really realizing what that means. Did everyone get that?
Yes, I certainly did. It's sort of vague, but it's coming through, I think, to some of us at least. What we should probably do, I'm addressing this to the 3 speakers now, is to open up the conversation into a more unstructured conversation between Elliot, Arnan, and Jeff. And maybe Elliot, you can go first. It's your turn, and then Jeff respond, or whomever respond, and we'll try to take this to a place where it's audible. So
yeah,
Elliot, please go ahead.
Yeah, and let me respond to Ken Boas's important point as well in the chat. I'll weave that in. I think we should all accept that seeing justice in Israel and Palestine is not going to have one single magic bullet strategy. There's going to be there are a lot of moving parts. There are radical voices. There are Palestinian voices we should be holding up and understand and accept that they have a way of describing the conflict from their own historical experience. There will be scholars that frame the conflict using the categories that scholars speak about. My contribution to this struggle is in speaking with Jewish community people, right? My role is not to jump out of the Jewish community and say, I agree with BDS and let me light myself on fire at the steps of the UN. That's, I feel, not going to move the needle. I feel like there has to be a role for speaking to American Jews who have an affective relationship to the state of Israel or to things Israeli or this history of Zionism that can get us to the same goals as a less or non-racist relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, and to sort of repair, perhaps transform some of the relations and damages that the occupation especially, but also going back to the Nakba, wreaked on the Palestinian people. I don't think that articulating the situation in its most melancholic and tragic form is always a shrewd strategy for getting people on board. I feel like there has to be some degree of uplift. If I were talking to Christians, as I often do in my courses, and narrate the history of violence and anti-Semitism, there has to be something beyond that where Christians can say, I am still holding on to a project of what Christianity should be. And I think most American Jews, most liberal American Jews, want to see whatever Israel is, the Zionist project or the state of Israel, as having a light side that they can hold on to while doing what they can to reduce harm for its history and toward Palestinians. Unlike Jeff, I don't think that logic was inevitable. I think there were many options, many paths that were not taken, and different voices. The one that won out, as you see, as we all know, has caused a lot of damage. So let me pause there. And,
All right, but Elliot, you said before in your first remark that Zionism was more than settler colonialism, occupation, with all the stuff, expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians. What's the more than?
I think there's at least at least three more than. One would be, as Peter Beinhard has framed it, the Zionism of rescue, that whatever the machinations of the Zionist project in Yishuv before 1948, the Zionist project allowed for a problem of a refugee problem of the Jews of Europe during the 1930s, maybe after World War I, but certainly after World War II. So there is that the Zionist project is also in some ways the savior of a large number of Jews who were refugees after the rise of Hitler. The second, though, and I think the more ideologically transformative, is that many of the original Zionist thinkers were talking about the creation of a just and socialist, which is my tradition, sort of arrangement, not necessarily a state, as Noam Chomsky often said when he was part of the Hashem Eretz Zair movement, that there were many people that didn't believe in even the idea of a state. And they were thinking of themselves as Zionists, that there was a cultural, linguistic, historical connection of Jews to the Holy Land. And so I think that transcends all the, tragic political action that happened and the decisions that were made in the early 20th century. So I think, and I would say there's probably another vision, which is that there was the binational or multinational sort of Zionism, where Jews will become part of the tapestry of the Middle East in cooperation with the Arab locals. Perhaps that might have been far left or perhaps even communist vision, but still have Zionists within a Zionist camp. That's a weak strand still existing in some quarters, but I think it was a real one and shared the values that we all have of nonviolence, of not seeing people as radically other, of seeing stateness as a problem in itself, but also as a solve for the Jewish problem of Europe. So I think we have to take that into consideration. So my sense of this is that this is a tragedy in which the Jewish people now have to figure themselves out with, not a sort of juggernaut Death Star of purposeful harm which ended up in the displacement of Palestinians.
You try to bring Arnon back in?
Well,
Arnon?
I look, nothing really changed. I'm switching through internet connection.
Now we hear you fine.
Go ahead, Arnon.
Now you hear me fine?
Yeah.
Fine. So as I was saying and wrote down, most people don't really get what settler colonialism is, in particular, how it is, how it should be applied to Zionism. And the problem is that again, the literature is not very simple, and also the force of the term itself, Israel, settlers. Oh, so there's settlers in the West Bank. Israel isn't quite colonial. We get that, but it has settlers. Let's just add the word settlers. It's a type of colonialism. All of these are very superficial applications of the term. And I would say most people who apply the term settler colonialism to Zionism do so as a way to more criticize Zionism. Am I, you can't hear me, huh? It's all stuck.
No, we can hear you.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
really?
Yeah. No, it's fine.
So
What would you call it then? To give it a name.
what? What do you mean what I would call it?
Whatever. Zionism, the situation, the conflict.
No, I definitely
you
agree.
approach it?
Like Jabotinsky, I
Mhm.
agree that Zionism faces the same dilemmas and challenges and problems and structures that other settler colonial movements face, right? So it helps me as a scholar to understand why certain things happen this way rather than another way, right? But here's something that people really don't get. Settler colonialism is not a type of colonialism. It is not colonialism with settlers. It is a structurally, it's almost antithetical. In real life, colonialism and settler colonialism intermesh all the time. The US, a quintessential settler colonial country, started out as a colonial British endeavor. We can all get that, right? So did the other Anglo colonies. They start out. They have colonial affiliations, certain settler movements, right? But if we look at the ideal types, and this is what we're trying to do when we're using the term, right? Then these two structures or historical analytical tools are markedly different, if not antithetical. Now, the difference is one, if colonialism in its ideal type form is focused on exploitation of a land, exploitation of the native population, their labor force, really kind of sucking up everything from that land and shipping it back to a metropole, shipping it back to mainland. That's the main focus. That's what colonialism is premised on. Colonialism is actually more premised on land, on sovereignty, on a particular sovereignty of the settlers, not sovereignty that belongs to not sovereignty that belongs to an imperial ruler. And so the main relationship that we see between colonials and natives is that of elimination. The indigenous people they don't perform an important part for attaining sovereignty in a new land. They actually interfere in retaining sovereignty in a new land. So that's why the relationship is characterized by elimination. Now, if the UK, if Britain, if there's no Indian people to work on harvesting tea and then consume textiles, then colonialism doesn't make sense. It's just not. It's just not a. It's just not a profitable endeavor, right? Colonialism needs natives. It needs a lot of them, right? Settler colonialism, on the other hand, actually prefers natives not be there to begin with.
Right.
And so these are important differences, really important. And and from the point of view of the natives, none of these pathways is very appealing. Either I'm exploited or I'm completely eliminated. And yet, it's important to keep that in mind.
Okay,
Now,
yeah.
and turning to settler to elimination, there are two ways, basic ways of getting rid of natives, and every settler colonial nation has done it. My settler colonial nation, the one I live in now, the one I belong to, and then equal rights for equal people. Give me one more minute, I'll get there, right? And your
Okay.
settler colonial nations, the one you live in, right, in the US.
Yes.
So one way is, of course, physical predation, right? And it can be in ethnic cleansing, it can be in genocide and disease also. I mean, that has also happened, particularly in the American continent. But Tasmania was all Tasmanians were destroyed. Native Maori population there. So, sorry, not Maori, Aborigine. So, but every settler colonial nation also opts for multiple forms of assimilation, of assimilating indigenous people into the settler body. And the type of assimilation is unthinkable in the colonial context, because since colonialism is premised on the existence of native people and the ability to exploit them, you would want the border between colonizer and colonized to be a very tall border wall, so to speak.
Yes.
But
Arnan, I'm just going to interrupt you for a minute. Take one more minute, and then we'll take 5 more minutes with the conversation we're having with the speakers, and then I want to leave time for question and answer. And
fine,
and just just give me just 1 second to say to use this opportunity to say that those who want to ask questions, please put them into the chat log, and I will I'll be fielding them. Please make them as brief and to the point as possible. So Arnan, please go on take 1 more minute, and then we'll get.
So at the end of the day, you have to realize, right, that any solution, right, that places Jews and Arabs in Palestine or Eretz Israel on an equal footing, and in a political arrangement in which the settlers are recognized as indigenous, quote unquote, right? They're recognized, okay, this is your land as well, right? The natives, because natives as an animal, they stop becoming political sense, right? They are no longer have the sole patrimony of the land. And so my point is that the project of one democratic state, if that democratic state has some sort of official recognition of the Jewish people, right? If it's a binational democratic state, then that would be a quintessential settler colonial consolidating maneuver. So that's where that's where I stand.
Great, thank you, Arnan. I'm glad we got you back in with some reasonable audio. Elliot or Jeff, would you like to jump in just for the next 5 minutes, and then we'll go as we accumulate questions. I'll feed them to you as well. But please, Elliot or Jeff, go right ahead.
Elliot.
Yeah, I think Arnaud's framing of settler colonialism is really interesting, and do check out his article from Haaretz I put in the chat. I also think that in practical politics, the discourse, for example, on the ADL's website, responds to the pernicious claim that Israel is a settler colonial state. It does kind of think of settler colonialism as just colonialism on steroids. It avoids the charge of colonialism by saying Jews are indigenous to the land of Israel, etc. And yeah, these are a bunch of like nationalist fictions. Absolutely, absolutely. I also have heard amongst Palestinian activists and Palestinian advocate activists to say that Israel is settler colonialist is not in the precise technical sense which Arnan is bringing to the table, which I think is really interesting and great, but rather as just another illegitimate colonial enterprise. And my concern as a pacifist is that this gives license then to a sort of revolutionary Franz Fanonian anti-colonial violence, which has just sort of enmeshed and entrenched Israeli intransigence and frankly, American Jewish rejection of the just claims of the Palestinian people. So I think in the actual use of the term settler colonialism in the political discourse has led to a bit of mischief and misunderstanding, one which I don't think has ameliorated people's political agenda around Israel, has set up stumbling blocks. Now, all that being said, the practices of the state of Israel gets the resistance sometimes it deserves. If Israel was engaged in a peace process as it was 93 roughly to 2001, there was more goodwill and less sort of animosity towards the state of Israel. People were rooting for a solution. People were supporting Palestinian businesses in the West Bank. So Israel, the state, and a very powerful state, holds most of the cards. That being said, we as activists and we as strategic actors in this story, I think we have to wonder how that term settler colonialism has an impact on the thinking of in actual practical political campaigns. And I see it having a mixed bag, some pernicious elements and also some education along the way, pulling the veil off of some people's eyes that Zionism did a lot of harm, had a lot of victims. And I think that's an important part of this story, no doubt. How I turn to the Jewish community and try to hold their hand and pull them to the left, that's a different strategic question. And that maybe is not your role. It's probably not most of your roles, but there is a role for that. And that's what I want to create some space for.
Okay, thank you, Elliot. We're still waiting for people to send in questions. So we'll give Jeff Helper the last word right now. And then as the questions come in, I'll have the speakers field them, but we haven't yet received many questions. So please, at this moment, if you'd like to ask a question, we have about 25 more minutes before we're going to be dismissed. So send in your questions now. But Jeff, do you want to say something in addition to or respond to Elliot or Arnan?
Yeah, well, I think I think settler colonialism is a very useful concept. It's not just academic, although it has academic parts to it. And it's basically, settler colonialism basically says that a foreign population comes to a country with the intent of taking it over, displacing the local population, and replacing their society, their country, and so on with its own country. Like I said, transforming Palestine into the land of Israel. And that's true of all settler colonial movements. And so again, I would, because I'm living here in the Palestine-Israel, so I guess I'm very concerned, or I've been very politically active. For me, there's an urgency about getting to actually a political settlement. It's not just an academic exercise, and we'll see what happens. I think we have to play a role, at least here. Not so much you guys in the States, although you can support us, playing a role in terms of really trying to formulate a political plan, a strategy, and organization for getting there. And from that point of view, the analysis is really important. I start my book by saying analysis matters, because if you think of if you misanalyze a situation, you can't conceivably get to a way out of it. So I think that the only way out of settler colonialism is decolonization. And from my point of view, that means ending Israel as a Jewish state, of course, but Israelis will stay. And the Palestinians will be restored their sovereignty, their country, their culture, and so on. But at the same time, it's a bitter pill for both peoples in a sense, because the Israelis are going to have to be part of a larger state with Palestinians, with a Palestinian majority. Even today, there's a Palestinian majority, and the refugees will return. And at the same time, the Palestinians have to give up their dream of a Palestinian state of their own. But nevertheless, I think one democratic state is a win-win for both, because for the Palestinians, in a sense, they get their country back, refugees return. And there is a process of indigenization of the Israeli Jews. This is their way out. The only way they're going to ever belong to this country and be a part of this country, instead of being settlers, really, who are always looking over their shoulders, who's a terrorist, who's resisting us, what land can we take, how can we grab this or that, which still is a dynamic here. They'll be able to relax and settle in. Now, the question of nationalism is an open question. There are some people that support the one state idea that see it as a binational state. The group I belong to, the One Democratic State Campaign, which is a Palestinian-led group here, would prefer to go the route of one democratic state of equal rights for all its citizens, in which you can express your national, ethnic, religious identities in other ways, but not necessarily in political sovereignty. There are a lot of peoples in the world that are very strong, important cultures that don't have national independence. I mean, the Kurds are one of them, the Basques, the Scots. I mean, there's a lot of peoples. A lot of them would like independence, but there are situations in which they simply have to reconcile themselves right now with the idea of a kind of a cultural sovereignty, or at least, and a good deal of control over their territory. So right. I think just my bottom line is that it's a win-win for both groups, and but it has to be based, from my point of view, on decolonization and transforming Israel and the occupation back into a state that belongs to all its citizens.
Great, thank you, Jeff. And all three of our speakers have touched on the question of decolonization, but I'm getting some questions in the chat log. I'm trying to merge them together. One is essentially, please say more about decolonization, what it would look like, and how, and critically, how it would be achieved. And maybe Jeff and others can talk about the campaigns that you're a part of toward that end.
Should I address that maybe?
Why don't you go right ahead, Jeff, and then we'll circle back to Elliot and no.
I mean, achieving it is a real issue because, of course, this has to be, in a sense, a struggle led by the Palestinians, in which we anti-colonial Israelis are a part of it, and hopefully you're a part of it. I talk in my book about a tripartite alliance of Palestinians, anti-colonial Israelis, and the international civil society, which is really reflective of the way the ANC organized the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. They didn't have, and I would say we have to forget Israeli Jews. For the most part, 98% of them are not going to accept this, just like the whites in South Africa didn't accept the end of apartheid. It had to be forced on them. When apartheid had to be made to collapse before the transition could take place. Once we got to a transition and the whites saw in South Africa that there was a place for them, there was a constitution already in place, then they went along with the transition. They weren't happy about it, but they went along with it. And I think that's what's going to happen here. So I'm less concerned about convincing Israeli Jews about this. I don't think we can convince them. And I'm less concerned with the American Jews, because I think a lot of them, especially in the younger generation, are beginning to come over to this critical anti-colonial view. The problem with the Palestinians is that, I mean, first of all, we have to have a political program, which we don't today. When we were boycotting South Africa, there was a clear end game. Why are we boycotting South Africa? One person, one vote. That was the program. And the clerk tried to sell all kinds of things to Mandela, and he said, "I'm one person, one vote," and that's it. We don't have that on the Palestine issue. Do we want two states, one state, binational state, federations? There's no clear voice. No one's speaking out. The only clear voice you have is a Palestinian Authority, and that's a collaborationist authority with Israel. So we have to formulate a political program. And I think our one democratic state has really done that in a lot of ways. We have a 10-point program that you can see on one state, I think it's called onestatecampaign.org, our 10-point program. The second thing the Palestinians need, of course, is political organization. There is no more PLO. The Palestinian Authority is not a political vehicle for them. The only political vehicle that exists today that's effective is Hamas. But that is, I think, a political vehicle that most of us could accept. So that's an issue. And then, of course, is the issue of strategy, and that gets into the tripartite thing. So I think there's a ways to go, but I think this is achievable. I think it really is achievable. Part of our problem is to convince Palestinians, who are so disappointed over everything over the years and just surviving, that there is a political space. This isn't just utopian, and in fact, we can get there. And one more sentence, and that is that I won't get into the whole thing of decolonization, but where it leads to is a new state. There's a new state that emerges that includes everybody, a democratic state. And there's a new civil society. In other words, now we're living together, we're studying together, we're watching TV together, we're going to football games together. There's a daily routine, a daily interaction that leads to, and this is really, I think, the hopeful part of our plan, to what's called a new political community. Beyond a civil society, a new us begins to emerge. A new sense of, we're living in the same country. We don't have a name for that country yet. I think it has to emerge with the new society. But especially in the younger generations, people are going to just beginning to live in a normal. I mean, part of the good news is that young people forget pretty quick. And within, I think, a half a generation, this is going to be normal. One state of all of us living together, just like in South Africa, it happened pretty quickly, that kind of normalization. So I think we have to begin to think about a political community. And let me just give one real quick example that some of you heard me say before, then I'll stop. And that is soccer, or as the rest of the world calls it, football. The Israeli, in the international standings, the Palestinian football team has a higher ranking than the Israeli national team. But neither one have gotten into the World Cup. And the World Cup is like 1,000 times bigger than the Super Bowl. So imagine if our combined team, the team of whatever this country is going to be called, gets into the World Cup. Now we're cheering our team. That's what a political community means. There's a new our. It doesn't neutralize your Palestinian identity. Doesn't neutralize your Israeli identity or Jewish or religious, or it's just another level of identity that's kind of an our team is, and that's the example of nation building that I think is very useful to look at.
Okay, great, thanks. Elliot, would you like to jump in?
Sure. Jeff is always a hard act to follow. I urge you all to, make sure he gets some FaceTime with your publics that you are responsible for. The public, which I'm most immediately concerned with, and maybe I should just say that the American Jewish support for Israel's shenanigans waxes and wanes. And however, it is growing increasingly not the most important actor. This week, several non-Jewish members of Congress, including somebody named Bacon, started a caucus, a kind of pro-Israel caucus for the promotion of Torah values, which is some weird Orthodox Jewish framing of a kind of, I believe, just a pro-Israel agenda. Increasingly, evangelical Christians are running interference for covering over Israel's worst policies and aspects. So I think it's important to keep in mind that Israel itself does not see American Jews as a reliable pillar of support outside of modern Orthodox Jewish communities. That being said, on the level of affect, most American Jews have a weird reaction to framing Israel in certain ways. But at the same time, when you describe the shenanigans, the racism, the land expropriations, the house demolitions, they relate to that because most American liberal Jews see themselves as in some ways anti-racist, for fairness, for democratic values. And I believe it's on that language we start to build. So do I go to the synagogue and say, hey, everybody, Israel's an apartheid Nazi-like, settler colonial state. That's not, doesn't get me anywhere. It gets me booted out of the synagogue, and I can't do any good work. I also have to say that advocating BDS in all of Israel also gets me kicked out of the synagogue. Boycotting settler goods, boycotting anything that happens in undemocratic Israel, the West Bank, different story. This is a different place of resistance. So I do think it's important how people are spoken to. And so sometimes we say to ourselves, well, we're not convincing anyone. We're not getting any traction with especially Jews or Jewish neighbors or Jewish interlocutors or people who are less politically radical. And sometimes that's about our framing. So I think it might be good for we activists to stop and think, maybe it's my register and tone, and maybe it's my strategy of engagement that's an issue here, and not just run to the most radical formulation. And I'm sorry to say, we're a bunch of cowboys here discussing the Indians, but sometimes that means not framing it in the way that the Palestinians themselves would recognize. Now, that might be in the abstract some injustice, but in terms of practical politics, it might actually get us more traction with people who we want to convince otherwise. In some ways, that's why I'm still holding on to working with J Street. They still have a program that's a Washington insider strategy, and which moves the Democratic Party and its allies to the left, rather than just saying, here's the truth with a quivering lip. I assert the tragic truth of Israel's apartheidness and its colonialists, its settlerist. That doesn't really get you anywhere because that's not playing the game of power, which is how policies get changed. And now, just to sort of wrap this up, I invite all of you, I hope, are activists on this issue. I don't think the Israel-Palestine dynamic is the most important issue in the world right now. We're dealing with climate change, a lot bigger apartheid-like situations, 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps in China. But Israel-Palestine is very close to our hearts, perhaps because we have a stake in it through religion, through ethnicity, through national allegiance. But I think we also have to realize that how we engage with different publics matter, and the framework of settler colonialism, unless called something else and explained in reasonable detail, won't get us that much traction. But I think Jeff Halper will get us some traction. And so I do speaking around and reading his books and internalizing the way he explains things is very well, and try to be more like him in front of our interlocutors.
Yes, thank you, Elliot. Thank you very much. One question that comes up and has come up in the chat relates to binationalism, and it's been mentioned before by some of our speakers. But how can the question of a binational future be reconciled with an anti-settler colonial program? Many feel strongly on either side of that. I guess one way to frame it is, if binationalism is not a politically viable future or something that can appeal to national communities living there, why not? And if so, why? Arnan or Jeff?
Arnan?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, binationalism is entirely congruent with settler colonialism. It is, in the case of New Zealand, for instance, exemplifies that. Like I said, at the end of the day, colonialists wish to kind of remain, keep a distinct hierarchy with the indigenous people. Otherwise, you just can't exploit them. You have no raison. You have no justification for why the citizen of the metropole can vote in parliament, and the native living in India, the Indians cannot, even though they're part of the same, overall empire. So colonial hierarchies are very important for colonialism. For settler colonialism, it's almost the opposite, right? Actually, you'd want to be you'd want any kind of indigenous identity to be to have as few political consequences or political manifestations. And the realm of binationalism, and there are several ways of articulating binationalism. Works very well in placing, so settler can say, look, yeah, maybe your family's here for 20 generations and I just came off the boat, but we're all citizens of this kind of state that has a binational arrangement that recognizes not only our equality as individuals, but the equality of our respective nationalities. And so therefore, any kind of privilege you'd ask for as just because you were there first or your family's there first is a null and void. It's not in the Constitution. So yes, look, if you want to pursue one state, and if that one state does not leave Jews in some sort of subordinate status, right? And and more so, if collective rights are somehow recognized by that state, promoted by that state. I don't know, official holidays, Hebrew as an official language. There's everything here works on gradations, right? There's no absolute model. But in any case, then in that case, Jews will have finally become indigenous to the land of Israel, to Palestine. And Palestinians, they won't stop becoming indigenous, but they'll lose that the exclusivity of it, right? They'll be the ones they'll the ones signing the Palestinians signing the constitution of this democratic state will be the Palestinians that will forfeit the exclusive indigenous status of the Palestinians and sharing it with the Jews. This is why settler colonialism sometimes is a win-win, right? I mean, of course, the win-win only after horrible violence transpired or perpetrated. But at a certain point, it just makes more sense for the settlers and for the indigenous to move their interactions on the playing field of a state with liberal and democratic institutions. But that doesn't mean it's any less settler colonial. That doesn't mean the U.S. stopped being settler colonial once the Native Americans were offered citizenship.
Yes, good.
Can I add one more word? I know we just have
Please.
another.
We only have a few more minutes. So Jeff, go right ahead for a couple minutes, and then we'll give Elliot the last word.
Okay. The problem, there's two problems with binationalism when we think about this this new state. First of all, the Palestinians are really very hesitant about it. Well, more than hesitant. They don't like the idea because binationalism, in a sense, legitimizes Zionism. It legitimizes the Zionist claim that that they're a national group, that they have a right to be in this country, that they're somehow equal to the Palestinian nationalism, and that the Palestinians have to accept that. And I think that's a non-starter for a lot of Palestinians. They say, look, we know Jews are going to stay here. We know Israelis are staying here. I mean, we know that. We know neither peoples are going to leave. We know that. But don't force us to accept the legitimacy of a settler colonial population, that's tried to expel us. That's one thing. The other problem with it is this issue of political community that I mentioned. you know, my fear is that binationalism is simply going to perpetuate the walls between the peoples. I mean, I would like, you know, my vision is, at least, that I speak only for myself. My vision is a country in which we have our identities, of course. I mean, in the United States, you have your identities as well. But at the same time, you know, we're living together in the country. It's functional, and we feel that there's a country and there's a people living here. Problem with binationalism is it's going to keep those walls. There's going to be Israeli Jews here, Palestinian Arabs there, and I don't think that's really the way to go. Do you know, in Israel today, by the way, you know, it doesn't break down Israelis, Palestinians. You've got 20,000 Israeli Jews that vote for the Joint Arab List. You've got half the Arab voters in Israel vote for Zionist lists, like the Labour Party or Meretz or Shas. A lot of the religious Palestinians vote for Shas, which is a very right-wing party, but it has
Likud is the number one. Likud, number one.
They vote for Likud, exactly. So that, you know, and you know, now we have the Islamic Party, Ram, here. They would rather be in a coalition with Netanyahu than with Bennett. So, yes, you know, all these things are very fluid, and I think the hope here is that, you know, once we get past the technicalities of the new state and decolonization, and we get there, that we'll be in a situation where we can really begin to break down these barriers, and it won't break down into Israel. You know, all the Israelis are afraid, what if there's a Palestinian majority? You see, they're still thinking in terms of Israelis are going to be here, Palestinians are going to be there, and if they're more than us, they'll outvote us. But the us is going to be different. I think there'll be class things in common. There'll be professional interests in common. There'll be religious values in common that cross those borders. And my fear, again, is that binationalism will prevent that. Will create a wall in which those cross national kinds of connections won't be able to happen, and a new us won't be able to emerge.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. And Elliot, I'm sorry we perhaps gave you short shrift, but Arnan, we were glad that we got you back in some audibly satisfactory way. And I want to thank all three of our speakers, Jeff, Arnan, and Elliot, as well as all of you for participating and attending this webinar. Please stay tuned for future ICAHD US webinars to come in the month of February and beyond. And check us out also and tell others about the Facebook presence as well. So thank you all very much. We're going to have to close it down now. It's 4:30, but wishing you all well. And once again, thanks to our speakers. All the best.
Thank you all. Thanks, Elliot, Arnon, Tom, Bob, and all.
Thank you.
Good night. It's 11:30 here.